welcome back to my channel. So this month I read Carrie Rawson, who is the daughter of the BTK killer. I read her book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming. So first I'm going to talk about my own outside research for the BTK killer, and then I'm going to do kind of a book summary and review. And the order might seem backwards, but it'll make sense once we talk about the book. And my sources will be linked in the description box if you're curious about where I got my information from. So the BTK killer's real name is Dennis Rader. He was active from 1974 to 1991, and the BTK stands for bind, torture, and kill, which is what he did to his victims. His first murder was in January 1974. He had stalked the residence to figure out who his victims were going to be and what he needed to do to make the kill successful and not be interrupted and not leave evidence or anything like that. So early in the morning, he cut the phone lines so that they wouldn't be able to call anyone, and no one would be able to call the family. And it was the Otero family. At about 7 o'clock that morning, he was able to sneak inside the residence when they were letting the family dog out. He was at first surprised to find that it wasn't just the wife and mother and the young daughter in the home, but he convinced the family somehow that he wasn't going to kill them. So first he tied up 38-year-old Joseph Otero, who was the husband and the father in this family. And then tied up Julie, 34 years old, who is his wife and the mother of their children. In that same order, he strangles Joseph and then Julie. Joseph Jr., the son, 9 years old, he took to his bed, the little boy's bedroom, tied him up, put a bag over his head, and smothered him, basically. And Josephine, the family's daughter, who was 11 years old, he hung in the basement. The family was discovered dead in their home by their oldest son, Charlie, who was 15 years old, when he came home from school that afternoon. The police were confused at the time by the fact that the family had no defensive wounds. It didn't really make sense for them all to be murdered, and it didn't look like they fought back at all. But their questions for how that worked out kind of gets figured out in the next case. In April of that same year, 1974, Dennis Rader attacks Kevin and Catherine Bright, who were siblings living together, aged 19 and 21, respectively. He broke into the home while they were away and waited for them until they got back. He told the siblings that he was a fugitive and that he wasn't going to hurt them, he just wanted food and money. So he tied them up in separate rooms. He shot Kevin twice in the head, and he was trying to strangle Catherine, but she struggled too much for him to really control the situation, and he ended up stabbing her 11 times, and she bled out over 5 hours. Kevin did somehow survive his attack, and that's how he was able to tell police that the killer had said that he wasn't going to hurt them, and so they figured that that was what had happened with the Otero family as well, that he had just convinced them that he wasn't really any danger. In October of that year, Dennis Rader writes his first letter to the Wichita Eagle-Beacon newspaper and named himself in that letter. And this was the start of a long correspondence that he had with the press. In March of 1977, Rader strikes again. He convinces a young boy to let him in his home. I think his story was that he showed him like a picture of his wife and says that he's looking for this woman because obviously he has a daughter that writes this book. Dennis Rader, the serial killer, has a wife and children. So in the home, he finds Shirley Vian, who is 24 years old. She has 3 children. He convinces her that he has sexual dysfunction. He can only be gratified by tying her up, and basically convinces her that he's just going to sexually assault her and not kill her, and that she will live if she complies, basically. Instead, he ties up her children in another room and ends up strangling her, as he does with his victims. He ends up getting interrupted by a ringing phone and flees the scene. This was different from his other murders in that he had been like casing a different home to attack and different victims, but ended up, I can't remember what exactly, I don't know exactly what happened, but for some reason he wasn't able to attack that family, but he like had all his stuff together to murder somebody. So just kind of like made do with that family. In December of 1977, he strikes again a woman named Nancy Fox, who was 25 years old. It's basically the same thing as what happened to Shirley in March of that year. He then, after he completes the murder, he calls 911 from a payphone nearby the residence. Then he doesn't attack again until April of 1985, a woman named Maureen Hedge, who was 53 years old. He strangled her in her home and then dumped her body down a dirt road in an attempt to throw police off his trail because so much time had gone in between and the MO was different. In September of 1986, he kills again. He dresses up and pretends to be a telephone repairman and convinces Vicki Wegerle, who was 28, to let him in her home. He tied her with leather shoelaces and strangled her. In January of 1991, his last victim was Dolores Davis, who was 62 years old. He snuck away from a camping trip that he was on to handcuff and strangle her in her home. He then dumped her body by a lake and returned to his camping trip as though nothing had happened. He ends up getting captured because in January of 2004, on the 30th anniversary of his first murders, the newspaper ran a story that many people had forgotten the BTK killer. So in March, just a couple months later, he wrote the newspaper a letter, and to remind people of himself, he claimed responsibility for a murder that he had not yet been tied to, which was the murder of Vicki Wegerle. So police had found DNA under her fingernails and then were able to connect it to the DNA from the Otero and Nancy Fox's murders that they also were able to collect some of his DNA from. They had suspected Dennis Rader as the BTK killer, and so were able to subpoena his daughter's DNA left from a medical exam without her knowledge, and they were able to run the DNA and find that Dennis Rader was a biological match with the BTK killer, basically. After his arrest, they are able to find plenty of evidence that he is the BTK killer, such as his detailed personal records regarding the murders that they found both at his home, but mostly at his place of work. On June 27th, 2005, Dennis Rader pled guilty to all 10 murders and at that time gave a detailed account of the murders he had committed. In August of 2005, he was sentenced to 10 life sentences. So now that we've talked about the BTK killer, and I know that was very broad strokes for the case, but that's more or less what happened, just so you have a general idea of who he is before we jump into talking about the book, which again, A Serial Killer's Daughter by Carrie Rawson. My biggest major complaint of this book was that I picked it up as a true crime fan and I wanted insight into what it's like being the family member of a serial killer, and also expected some background on the BTK killer. But you don't get it in this book because this book is more of a Christian memoir, honestly. Carrie Rawson is a very faithful woman, and this book is more about how she uses the tragedy in her life to grow in her faith. Really, a big chunk of this book is recounting a hiking trip she took in the Grand Canyon with her father and how she kind of had a come to Jesus moment in the canyon. Another thing that I really don't like about this book is how Carrie Rawson really victimizes herself when her father is a horrific serial killer, which is another reason why I wanted to go over all those cases first, so you could really get a grasp for the lives that he ruined, the absolute tragedies that this man committed. Because the vast majority of this book is Carrie Rawson discussing how difficult it is for her to deal with that. And it's not that I don't understand that, I can't imagine what it's like to find out that your father has done these things. She loved her father, she knew that he had a temper and he had, he wasn't perfect, but overall she loved her father very much. And they had a good relationship, so this was shocking and very difficult for her. But Carrie Rawson over and over again emphasizes and blatantly states that she is a victim and people don't understand what a victim she is of this, literally calling herself a victim, which I don't really like. I think that when we're talking about a killer, the focus should be, you know, I know that this is going to be a different perspective, but she doesn't really talk about the murder victims that much. She just like throws in a little bit here and there, like, and on this day, like while she's telling her childhood story, if there's a date where someone was murdered, she'll talk about what was going on in her family life and then say, and on whatever day he murdered like so-and-so. And so in that way, I think this book doesn't really pay enough respect and give enough visibility to the real victims, which are the people that he murdered or attacked and survived. And a really big example of this for me was when Carrie Rawson writes about her father when he pleads guilty and talks about how he murdered his victims and gives like details to the court so that the family members of the victims hear basically what happened. She complains that it was very hurtful for her and her family to have to listen to that, and really makes a big deal about like, well, nobody asked when they like share this information about what he did. No one asked his family if it was okay for that information to be shared. And it's like, well, they didn't have to ask you if it was okay to share this information, because this moment is not about you. This moment is about the families like trying to understand or come to terms with what happened to their loved ones. It's about the truth coming out. It's about, you know, him getting his justice of going to jail for what he did. So no, I don't think that the courts should ask the family of a murderer, oh, are you okay if we, you know, share how he murdered? Because it's not about you. It's about the families and friends of his murder victims. And so I really didn't like how she, again, like took the lens off of people who had died and been brutalized and instead put the focus on her. You know, I understand, again, this is her memoir. It's about her perspective. So I would understand that to some extent, but it really feels like she has no respect for the family, for the loved ones of the people her father murdered. Overall, it's a quick read, which was good because I really wanted to get through it. But if you're a true crime fan, definitely do not pick this book up, and I would say, because it doesn't give you any insight to the crime, really. It just gives you insight to Carrie's trauma, and how she handles the situation, which again, I think she handles poorly. I know that she is a big advocate. I know that Carrie has become an advocate for victims of abuse, crime, and trauma. I don't know how she advocates for that. But I would think, as someone who advocates for victims of crime and trauma, she would have more appreciation for the Upteen's time, the loved ones of the people that her father murdered. That being said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I know this probably wasn't my best true crime video. Again, I was hoping to get more material from the book, as I have with my other videos of this nature. And so I was trying to get used to, I guess, a different kind of format to try to cobble this together. But again, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you learned something. Yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.